Every hour, the largest bell in the Peace Tower on Parliament Hill rings out loud and clear. At over 6 feet high and weighing 9 tons, it's a massive bell and just one of 53 that play high above Ottawa. On its debut to the nation, Prime Minister Mackenzie King called it the voice of the nation. Do you know what's inscribed on that bell? It's Luke 2:14. Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men. I can't think of another man in our country's political history that spent his life working tirelessly as he did for the goodwill of all men, other than Mr. Tommy Douglas. Canadians agree because in an expansive poll in 2004, he was voted the greatest of all Canadians, beating out Elliott Trudeau and Terry Fox for the top spot. So he is revered in our country for those who know him. Tommy Douglas was born in Falkirk, Scotland in 1904. He could be called a true visionary, but with humble roots. He was first ordained as a Baptist minister in 1930. He later became the leader of the Saskatchewan Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, henceforth in this lecture, the CCF. I don't want to have to repeat that every time I mention his party. He then became premier of that province for 17 years, from 1944 to 1961. Then he became the founding leader of the National New Democratic Party, the NDP, in 1961. And perhaps most famously, Tommy Douglas is known as the father of universal public health care in Canada. I had 2 hospitalizations and surgeries in the last 8 months, and I owe a great debt of gratitude to Mr. Tommy Douglas that I came out of those surgeries not owing a penny, having already paid lots of taxes, though, to help out. Mr. Douglas was referred to as the conscience of our nation. He was a small-framed man weighing a whopping 135 pounds, but he was nonetheless a champion boxer, and he continued to play box at least well into his advanced years. He was known as an extraordinary orator, with people driving for hours across the prairies to hear him. Allegedly, he was blessed with a photographic memory because he could cite facts and figures as if plucking them out of the air. The family of his childhood was faithfully religious, but not a harsh home. Tommy's mother, Ann, was a Baptist, and his father was a Presbyterian. They often had visitors, and frequently the carpet in the front room was rolled up, and there would be dancing of the Highlands schottische and poetry recitations. This was the Douglas household, faithful, but not dour. I appreciated that explanation. Tommy dropped out of high school to take up menial jobs, eventually working for 5 years to acquire a journeyman's apprenticeship, but he discontinued his apprenticeship to become an ordained minister. In 1925, he enrolled at Brandon College to finish his high school studies and to take up the subject of theology. Upon graduating from Brandon College, he then enrolled eventually by correspondence to McMaster University, where in 1933 he earned an MA in sociology. I'll tell you about the paper that he wrote as his thesis at the time. But at Brandon College, his fellow students and professors introduced Douglas to the idea of the social gospel. I suspect as soon as I say that I've divided the congregation because of your various understandings of the social gospel. Wait until the end to figure out what it really means. But the social gospel will become the keystone principles of Douglas's life and his politics. He was very involved in his church as a young man. His sister used to say that he went to church on Tuesday for Scouts, on Wednesday for prayer meeting, on Friday night for youth group, and then 3 times on Sunday, to 2 services morning and evening, and then Sunday school, as well as taking an active role in organizing a church youth group and a Boy Scout troop. So he knew what ministry was all about. At 6 years of age, Tommy's family immigrated to Canada, settling in the booming railroad city of Winnipeg. At that time, Winnipeg was a frontier city with mud streets and frame buildings with about a population of 150,000. And it was the most ethnically diverse city in Canada as immigrants arrived from all over Europe to start a new life. And so from an early age, Tommy was encouraged by his father to embrace the ethnic mix of Canada. A significant event that was taking place during his childhood was repeated hospitalizations. It is believed that he was probably hospitalized as many as 18 times with a condition that was later diagnosed as osteomyelitis, I believe is the diagnosis. And one renowned surgeon wanted to amputate his leg. But this surgeon ended up taking Tommy on free of charge if he could use Tommy as a teaching case for the rest of the students. So keep that experience in his child in mind when we talk a little bit later about universal health care. Around the same time and when Tommy was a young man, it was through the work of the All People's Mission in Winnipeg that Tommy was first exposed to the reformist thinking of the social gospel. The social gospel movement, which Tommy called simply practical Christianity. And this movement of missions grew up in response to the suffering of many at the dawn of the industrial age and alongside early 20th century excitement with new ideas and knowledge. The All People's Mission was founded by the Methodist Church, which was famous. It probably was the chief originator of these missions in Canada because their vision was to provide healthy, sanitary, and morally sound human environments where Canada's largest populations would gather across the nation. Among these, the All People's Mission in Winnipeg stands out because it was established in 1892 in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods. So Tommy was exposed to the All People's Mission and their desire to be true to the gospel, but be practical in their help of people every day. Right after the First World War, Winnipeg was ripe for conflict between bosses and workers. Imagine this, the cost of living went up 73%, while wages only increased by 13%. And lo and behold, a conflict developed in Winnipeg, ultimately coming to what is famously referred to as Bloody Saturday, when crowds of strikers, it is reported anywhere from 25 to 35,000 on strike in Winnipeg at the time. So the strikers were gathering in front of Winnipeg City Hall. Tommy and a few other boys climbed on top of a roof to watch the protest. It was a peaceful demonstration of strikers until the Royal Northwest Mounted Police appeared on horseback along with a force of special constables. These special constables were, in essence, hired thugs, and they wielded baseball bats and hoe handles against the demonstrators as the Mounties charged the crowd with clubs and revolvers. Bloody Saturday left a searing impression on Tommy. He had seen a peaceful protest crushed by the state in defense of corporate and government interests. Tommy would always see the world from the perspective of helping the common man stand up for himself. In 1929, Calvary Baptist Church in Weyburn, Saskatchewan was looking for a new minister. And Calvary had ties to Brandon College, where Tommy was in his last year of school. So he was hired by the church along with one of his pals, and they shared the pastoral duties for that year. The deacons trying to decide which one they would hire after hearing them preach, they decided a year later to hire Tommy, T.C. Douglas. He would remain in that church as pastor for the next 5 years. One of my favorite stories about Tommy during that time was a call that he received from the police magistrate in which he was told that 11 juvenile delinquents were going to be arraigned in court that day. And Tommy goes on to say, he ends up at the court, and he wrote, maybe it was because it was Monday, and I hadn't gotten over the Sunday sermon, but I ended up having all 11 of these juvenile delinquents to get committed to my care. I wondered what on earth I was going to do with them. I took them home. To march in 11 ragamuffins was quite a sight, and my wife, to whom I'd been married less than a year, just about went to be with her mother. She was a good sport, though. So you get a glimpse into the heart of this man for struggling, even juvenile delinquents. With the Great Depression raging through drought-savaged Saskatchewan, Douglas witnessed great human suffering firsthand. And at that point, he joins the Saskatchewan Labour Party, believing that he could do more as a politician than as a pastor. Alan Blakeney, the NDP Premier of Saskatchewan from 1971 to 1982, later recalled that when he, that is Tommy, got into politics, he didn't change his message, he didn't abandon his faith, he simply changed his pulpit. Interesting, isn't it? As idealistic as Tommy was, he fell prey to a very toxic idea. As I mentioned to you, Douglas earned an MA in sociology by correspondence from McMaster University. His thesis was entitled "The Problems of the Subnormal Family," and it was a program arguing for the use of eugenics, controlling the poor and criminal element of society by sterilizing them and restricting them to state-owned colonies or camps. In case studies drawn from around Weyburn, Douglas documented numerous what he called immoral and moral women. That would be prostitutes. The non-moral women were the women that were being used by men and others who would control them. And he studied their 200 children and grandchildren. Collectively, the group had high rates of sexually transmitted disease, mental illness, and police involvement. Douglas wrote, listen carefully, "Surely the continued policy of allowing the subnormal family to bring into the world large numbers of individuals to fill our jails and mental institutions and to live on our charity is one of consummate folly." Made me just about sick when I read those words. The solution he suggested was that couples should be certified as to their mental and physical fitness before married. He even insinuated that women who had children from multiple men should be examined as to their mental state. I read this and realized, I'd have been part of the subnormal family under Tommy's eugenics. He said subnormals would be segregated into state farms or colonies, and the mentally defective and curably diseased should be sterilized. In 1928, the United Farmers Government in Saskatchewan passed the Sexual Sterilization Act and applied it frequently to inmates in professional institutions. Now pause for a moment and let me remind you that it has been observed that what people do with their power speaks more profoundly of the true character of their lives than their youthful, uneducated speculation. So that years later, with the benefit of further consideration and the horrors perpetrated by the Nazis, now made known to the world, Douglas fully repudiated his support for eugenics. Keep in mind that Douglas always viewed the government to be failing in its role of the support of the common man and of the people. Another event in 1935 involved 1,400 interior workers who banded together and were on their way to Parliament Hill for a demonstration, were stopped by the government at the time in Regina and suppressed again by the RCMP. And Tommy saw that as yet another opportunity to demonstrate that the government had lost its concern for the people, and he was motivated to do something about it. In 1936, Douglas went to Europe as a delegate to the World Youth Congress in Geneva, making side trips to Spain where the war was raging. While he was there, he went to see one of Hitler's rallies in Nuremberg. Douglas was deeply disturbed to see rank upon rank of troopers saluting the Führer as German bombers roared overhead. He said he felt the palpable presence of evil. And he came back and correctly predicted that without a forceful response to Hitler's Germany, Canada would ultimately be drawn into the war. And so it was inevitable that he drafted himself in the Canadian Army during World War II. Let me pause for a moment and remind you, are you tracking with me, church family? Say, we're tracking with you, Derek. Let me tell you briefly about his political career. He was elected to the Canadian House of Commons in 1935. And during his 2 terms as a leader, he earned a reputation of being a skillful and witty debater. And then it was due to his popularity that he was elected as the leader of the Saskatchewan CCF in 1942. In 1944, he gave up his federal seat to run in the Saskatchewan general election. Watch this now. He ended up winning 47 seats out of the 53 in the Legislative Assembly, thus forming the first democratic socialist government in North America. As the Premier of Saskatchewan, he ruled for 17 years, winning all subsequent provincial elections until 1960. In 1961, he resigned from his post as a Premier to take up leadership in the newly founded New Democratic Party. He remained there until 1971. From 1971 to 1979, when he retired, he kept his seat in federal politics, retiring in 1979. So I get a kick out of listening to people talk about how raucous politics have become in our world. When I do any research into politics of the past, I discovered that we may actually be on the very tame side, because fruit and rotten eggs were occasionally thrown at Douglas. And his opponents would get young men drunk and then send them in to disrupt the meetings. During one particular meeting, a group of drunken thugs stormed the platform where Tommy was seated, and he took a glass water jug and smashed it and said, "To the first person that comes on the platform, you'll get the sharp edge of this jar across your face." And they, of course, settled down. In later campaigns, Douglas' motorcade was met in some towns with homeowners displaying coffins on their front lawns. He ruffled more than a few feathers, so much so that his challenge of the status quo earned him many opponents in high places. Corporations and media, as well as the federal government, were hostile to his new party. A committee was formed that included the presidents of the following renowned corporation: Noranda Mines, Imperial Oil, International Nickel, and Massey Harris, to coordinate the opposition against Tommy's party. Simpson Sears even offered its catalog network to distribute liberal literature to the masses of population across Canada, where they would headline the following accusations: socialism leads to dictatorship, CCF government would take away your farms, and would you pay 20% tax on everything? No such measures had ever been proposed by the CCF. But Tommy was often labeled as a Nazi and sometimes as a Bolshevik. And he would respond by inviting anyone that wanted to publicly debate him, because he had fully and completely denounced communism. Though, as an interesting sidebar, you might be interested to know that from the time Tommy entered politics until about 10 years ago, well after his death, there was a sealed document in which the Canadian Security Agency in Canada had a sealed file on any dealings that Mr. Douglas had with Communist Party. Nothing was ever proven, and Tommy would say it was all allegation. So what was the man's appeal? I think it is in the following paragraph. Appealing to the mainstream, Douglas said to the CCF, about the CCF, "This is a people's movement, a movement of men and women who have dedicated their lives to making the brotherhood of man a living reality." That platform rang a bell with the average taxpayer. Indeed, it was not because the voters of Saskatchewan were socialists that they elected a socialist government. Rather, Saskatchewan supported the CCF because the party and its leader proposed practical measures with tangible benefits. Voters continued to elect them over and over again because they delivered what they promised. When asked the question, how socialist was the CCF government of Saskatchewan, political historians correctly observe that anyone answering that question will begin with their own question: it all depends on what you mean. What exactly do you mean? It is without argument that Tommy Douglas developed a responsible government. He was known to lead his cabinets in what some of his co-workers called a Quaker style. That is, he didn't want to vote. He wanted to get the sense of what everyone was thinking in the room, because he led by consensus. At lunch, he would line up in the legislative cafeteria with everyone else. He sat with civil servants and backbenchers, and thus he heard from all sides. Douglas, perhaps his greatest achievement politically at that time was Douglas's government was financially cautious and conservative. Canadians, this is an aside, Canadians ought to be screaming bloody murder about the debt that we are incurring as a province and as a country. Listen carefully. Previous governments before Tommy Douglas ran deficits and accrued so much debt that Saskatchewan had the second largest per capita debt of any province province in Canada when the CCF took office. From this starting point, the Douglas government recorded a budget surplus in each of its 17 years and steadily paid down the debt accrued by its predecessor. This was at least personally consistent because Douglas never borrowed anything his whole life on credit and was quite proud of that achievement. Clarence Fiennes, who was the provincial treasurer, was central to his success. He was the de facto deputy premier, and he was able to balance the budget every year. Now let me talk to you about sweet advisors. All good leaders know how to bring competent advisors around them. Douglas invited George Cadbury. You ever had a Cadbury candy bar? To advise his government. Cadbury was the descendant of the confectionery dynasty of the same name. The Cadbury Company was founded in the United Kingdom in the early 19th century by a prosperous Quaker family that took an interest in the well-being of their workers. Their historical interest in operating a successful business while promoting social justice was passed down through the generations along with the Cadbury name. So Douglas invited Cadbury to come and advise his government, and he did, and the government became efficient, rational, and professional. For his greatest political challenges, Douglas was unprecedented in securing expert advisors from the United States to coach and counsel his government in his history-making programs, and he would often persuade them to come without pay, only covering their expenses. So switching gears, Canadians sometimes have their head in the sand when it comes to the problem of racism in our country. Marian Anderson, the great African-American contralto and a courageous pioneer among artists of color, visited Regina in 1956. Clarence Fiennes, the deputy prime minister, was at the Saskatchewan Hotel to meet her. Upon her arrival, the front desk informed her that there were no rooms available for her in the hotel. Famously, in 1939, Anderson had been barred from performing at the Daughters of the American Revolution's Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C., to which President Franklin Roosevelt and his wife Eleanor arranged for her to sing before 75,000 people at the Lincoln Memorial on Easter Sunday of that year. Douglas Fiennes was not about to see her turned away from a hotel in Regina. He asked to speak to the hotel manager. He inquired whether they had a liquor license. They did. He indicated that if they wished to keep it, a room would be found for Miss Anderson immediately. She was soon a guest in the hotel. Douglas hired Japanese Canadians, which elicited openly racist criticism from both inside and outside the CCF. But Douglas would lambaste his critics. Even prior to the end of the Second World War, the CCF invited Japanese Canadian internees to resettle in Saskatchewan at a time when most of Canada was trying to keep Japanese Canadians from settling among them. One of Reverend Douglas's achievements in 1947 was the passing of the Saskatchewan Bill of Rights. Watch this carefully. It protected freedom of conscience, opinion, religion, expression, and association. It prohibited arbitrary arrest and detention. It also prohibited discrimination in employment, property ownership, accommodation and services, and professional associations and unions. Here's what's interesting about it. It preceded the United Nations adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by a full year, and came 13 years before the Canadian Bill of Rights, which was enacted in 1960. Douglas maintained that he was doing God's work, but somewhere along the line, he stopped going to church. I've dug as much as I could into the reasons. The closest answer I could draw is that many believe that when he went to church, he was plastered with questions. He felt that he was disrupting the worship and he could not worship God alone. And so he began to, as his father did, to, sadly, worship God privately. That's one of the explanations. But it is clear from the biographers that I read that he himself did not lose his faith. Of course, universal health care is widely held as his greatest achievement. Tommy Douglas had long been a believer in universal health care, and that belief was born out of his social gospel background and seeing farmers unable to afford health care during the Great Depression. So he announced this program in 1959. His plan covered every person in Saskatchewan with a prepaid, publicly administered health care. There was no small reaction, especially among the doctors in Saskatchewan. A protracted strike took place, and the passing of the health bill in Saskatchewan was nearly defeated. Yet by the time that Medicare is adopted in 1962, these attacks dissipate. Interestingly, it was a renowned doctor from Britain who came over to settle the dispute and was able to sign an agreement between the cabinet and the College of Physicians. That was around 1962. So Tommy explained his passion for universal health care. In one of his earlier speeches about it, he said, "To me, it seems to be sheer nonsense to suggest that medical care is something which ought to be measured just in dollars. When we're talking about medical care, we're talking about our sense of values. Do we think human life is important? Do we think that the best medical care which is available is something to which people are entitled by virtue of belonging to a civilized society?" He was deeply committed to the reality that it's uncivilized to exclude any citizen from access to universal care. You know, of course, that the CCF did not invent the idea of public health care. It was enacted in 1948 in Britain by a Labour Party government, and several other industrial countries implemented publicly funded health care in the years after World War II. But it is clear that his achievement in health care served to create a national demand for what would eventually become our universal health care system, with all parties, every one of them, jumping on Douglas's bandwagon. But it was not fully federally adopted until 1984, much longer than when Tommy Douglas introduced it. In a twist of fate, Douglas's proudest achievement, his universal health care, delivered a short-term blow during which the public did not lose their sour taste for the protracted doctor strike, and some believe that the conflict sowed the seeds of their defeat to the Liberals in 1964, their first loss in 20 years. There's a lot more to that story, but I'm going to jump over it and just talk to you for a moment about when politics or leadership becomes personal. On December 2nd, 1969, the Beverly Hills home of Tommy's daughter Shirley and her husband, the actor Donald Sutherland, was raided by the Los Angeles police. Shirley was alone with her 3 children. The police searched the home while Shirley and her eldest son Tom were made to stand up against a wall. Her 2 younger children, Kiefer Sutherland, you ever heard that name? If you watched the 24 series, you know who Kiefer is. So her 2 younger children, Kiefer and Rachel, cried alone in a bedroom as the police rifled through their possessions. The police found nothing, but they charged Shirley with conspiracy to obtain a destructive device, a bomb. Her crime, it seemed, was that she had participated in a fundraising event for Friends of the Black Panthers, which supported a free breakfast program for poor children. The Black Panthers was a radical black power movement. Shirley's interest was the breakfast program. Douglas himself called a press conference in which he declared that he was certain that Shirley was innocent and said, "I'm proud of the fact that my daughter believes, as I do, that hungry children should be fed whether they are Black Panthers or white Republicans." The next day, he flew to Los Angeles to be with Shirley. Several months later, the charges were thrown out of court. Tommy continued to insist that it was because of his political views that his daughter was targeted. And lo and behold, for her entire acting career, she was never granted permission to act in the United States. She was restricted in her movement because of that charge. It was confirmed later, though, that Shirley had been framed, not only for her involvement with the Black Panthers, but because of her father's political views. How many of you were born in the 60s? That wonderful era of the 60s. Any of you put your hand up? Am I the only one? Wow, we remember those days. You remember the bombings, the murders, and the martial law that was enacted shortly after the 60s? During the 1960s, the FLQ conducted a protracted bombing campaign against the Montreal establishment, exploding 95 bombs. That's a lot. On October 5th, 1970, James Cross, a British diplomat, was kidnapped by a small group of people who claimed to represent the FLQ. The kidnappers demanded the broadcast of their manifesto, a ransom payment, the release of French political prisoners, and a plane to fly the kidnappers to either Cuba or Algeria. The government refused to pay, and 6 days later, the Quebec Labor Minister, Pierre Laporte, an old school chum of Prime Minister Trudeau, was kidnapped by another group. Both of their bodies would turn up later. On October 15, Trudeau turned up dead, by the way. On October 15, Trudeau held a late-night meeting with the leaders of the opposition parties, Tommy Douglas, Robert Stanfield, and Réal Caillat. He told them that they would be imposing the War Measures Act early the next morning and would ask Parliament to ratify the decision later in the day. At 4 o'clock in the morning on October 16, the War Measures Act came into effect. Before dawn, police in Quebec began to raid homes and arrest those suspected of sympathizing with the FLQ. Hundreds of people were arrested without charge. The laws of their country had been changed overnight. They now could be held without charge for 90 days, and organizations could be declared subversive or illegal. The Bill of Rights no longer applied. The army mobilized. Canada was suddenly a police state. Tommy met with the NDP caucus that day and said, "My position is to oppose it. I'm against it, period." The NDP lost 13% of their approval rating that day. Tommy was severely criticized, both by parliamentarians and Canadians across the country, but he stood against the War Measures Act on principle that the government already had broad powers to deal with treason, sedition, conspiracy, and offensive weapons, and that if these powers were not enough, they needed to go back to Parliament and secure a vote to get the support, the right support, not just giving the Prime Minister the power to enact the War Measures Act. So he gave a principled response. Listen to what Tommy Douglas explained as to why he would not support that act. If we're going to tell the people that we value democracy and that democracy is the way of dealing with social change, we must use the democratic procedures and not revert on our part to the very kind of violence that we're condemning on the other side. On an acrimonious television panel, he told the Canadian people, "I want to remind you that in the 1940s, the government of Canada passed regulations under the War Measures Act to intern all Canadian-born Japanese. I remember being booed off the platform in Vancouver for opposing that. People said, the government tells us there's a yellow peril and these Japs are going to blow up railways and everything. What happened?" Douglas asked. "We locked them up and confiscated their property. And at the end of the war," Mr. King said, "there's not a single proven case of sabotage by any Canadian-born Japanese." Tommy Douglas was right. Although the analysts of the 1970 October crisis would later widely agree that Trudeau overreacted as it unfolded, Douglas and the NDP stood alone in the opposition to the War Measures Act. He could not see any justification for the suspension of civil liberties, so he stood with those whose rights he believed were being violated. Willing to endure popular hatred, unbending at his party's heavy political cost, to stand steadfast for the sake of his moral convictions. Oh God in heaven, please give us politicians with some moral backbone who make their decisions not with one eye on the pole, but with both eyes on what is right, for the good of the country, for the protection of our freedoms. Tommy Douglas was a strong believer in limiting the power and control of the government. I stand completely with him. He worked hard for the unity of Canada. In a 1964 bitter debate on the new national flag, dragging on for about 5 weeks, parking especially on the matter of dropping St. George's Cross as a national symbol, Douglas chastised the House for wasting time when they could be acting on more pressing ideas. And he said, "Let us remember, first of all, that Christianity is not the only faith in Canada. There are people of Jewish faith, the Mohammedan faith, and the Buddhist faith." Douglas was a Baptist minister. By the way, he retained his ordination and preached occasionally in Baptist churches nearly till the day that he died. But his Canada was inclusive because we practice as a nation the freedom of religion. In his speech during the flag debate, he spoke in support of Pearson's design of the 3 maple leaves. You see that? That was almost our flag. but also suggested that a single maple leaf would be better to symbolize a unified country. He moved that instead of the flag debate tying up Parliament, a committee should study the question and report back. The committee produced the red and white flag with a single maple leaf that we now know today. Douglas would never have called himself the father of our flag, and doubtless the thought was a minor one to him, but it seemed quite fitting that he had a hand in the creation of the national emblem now. And I'm telling you that every time I look at our flag, I'm going to zero in on that one flag which represents unity. Because I told you in my first lecture on Edgerton that the strength of our country is not our diversity, it is our unity. It is the sharing of one common experience and law in Canada that makes us strong. His vision remained strong until the end. In his last speech as the leader of the New Democratic Party, Douglas quoted one of his favorite prayers, and he said, "May we be the children of the brighter and better day, which even now is beginning to dawn. May we not impede, but rather cooperate with the great spiritual forces which we believe are impelling the world onward and upward. For our supreme task is to make our dreams come true and to transform our city, that is our country, into the holy city, God's own country." Douglas died of cancer in February of 1986. He was 81 years of age. Please allow me to make just a couple, or maybe a few, concluding remarks. I won't preach. You still tracking with me? Say, "Keep going, Derek." A little louder. Thank you. I've had a few comments about how inappropriate it is to bring politics to the pulpit. I assure you that I respect your opinion, but I don't share it, nor am I rattled in the least, because I think our people need to hear the truth about our country, and they need to be able to incorporate their faith with their politics. If you listen carefully, I'm giving you a good diet of how a Christian should behave. And if Christians don't participate in defending the democracy that we enjoy in Canada, we will be part of losing it and giving it up. I have absolutely no intention of turning this pulpit into a political campaign. I will preach the Bible faithfully every week, but I will use every opportunity that I can to tell you this is who we've been, and who we've been is who we should continue to be unless we can demonstrate that there's a sensible reason to abandon it. So my point is we cannot disconnect from our national forebears without fundamentally risking what this country was meant to be. We're putting everybody at risk by closing the door on our history and damning their faithful acts that have made us what we are as a country. Let me speak about the social gospel versus the whole gospel. I think that it's a false dichotomy. By the way, I would not say that Tommy Douglas is one of my spiritual giants because of this issue. I would say he's one of my political heroes, for sure. But at the turn of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, the social gospel was making inroads because of the vast amount of poverty and disease and brokenness that was ravaging the country. And there were all kinds of churches who called themselves fundamentalist churches that taught the Bible but never tried to make a difference in the lives of broken and hurting people. And I think it was a tragic mistake. I think it's a false dichotomy, by the way, to try and force someone to choose between the social gospel and theological integrity, because I think you can have both. I think you can remain faithful to the gospel of Jesus Christ in all of its fullness and know what the Bible teaches, and at the same time have ministry to the poor and help people whose lives are a mess. The best kind of ministry is the ministry that keeps one foot planted firmly in the scriptures and the other firmly in the neighborhood. But lo and behold, the average Christian wants to come to church and hear a nice sermon and then forget about the masses of hurting people that are devastated all around them. Tommy Douglas said no. Tommy Douglas was one, listen, he said, it's not enough to talk about pie in the sky. It wasn't enough to talk to people about some afterlife with no misery, sorrow, or tears. We had to concern ourselves with the problems people had here and now. What I was trying to do in the churches, he says, and in the meeting local organizations when we met with other churches was to constantly remind people that Jesus said it was better for a man that a millstone be hung about his neck and to be cast into the depths of the sea than that one of these little ones should perish. Tommy wanted to make a new Canada for these impoverished children, to have a chance at education and medical care, and to have a new lease on life. So what I'm saying is, I don't fully agree with Tommy's social gospel. And I think he made a mistake in erring on one side, potentially excluding the other. Though many of the quotes I read from Mr. Douglas, even to his last days, I would say that sounds solidly Christian. But he was called out of the pulpit of a local church to serve in government and made a massive difference in our country. Most of the social welfare programs that are in place now in Canada were initiated by Tommy Douglas, and he used to say, it is because of my Christian faith that we have enacted these social welfare programs. So here's what I'm saying. Faith without works is dead. You may say you have all kinds of faith. If you are not engaging that faith in acts of love and service to make somebody else's life better, you've not yet discovered biblical faith or the faith of Jesus. So when I finished studying the life of Tommy Douglas, I felt like somebody hit me right between the eyes and said, "What motivates you, Bartlett? What fires you up to do what you're doing? Are you just marking time, marching through life to the grave? Or do you have a vision to make a difference in the world today?" You know what came immediately to my mind was Paul's words in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, "For the love of Jesus Christ constrains us, compels us, motivates us." It's the love of Jesus Christ clearly inhabited the heart of the greatest Canadian of all time, according to that famous poll. And then, of course, Tommy was famous for preaching that text, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength." And, he said, don't you claim to love the Lord your God if you don't also love your neighbor. And we heard last week who our neighbors are, didn't we? Would you let me pray for you? I pray that lessons of faith and walking with you and developing our hearts in compassion and care for poor and broken and hurting and oppressed people will rise up in our hearts. Lord, I thank you for this great man and the impact he's had on the country I love, my country, Canada. And I recognize that I enjoy great privileges today because of his many long years of working hard, tirelessly even, for the good of our country. Please raise up more people like him, Lord, to bring Canada back to you. Oh God, bring us back to you. We've drifted far from our roots, and we've lost sight of what we can really be with your hand upon us. And I pray that you would stir in every one of us those true motivations of the love of Jesus Christ. I pray in his name. Amen.